poverty has always been with us. Uh, Neoliberalism has done nothing to resolve it. The last SECC was a grim reminder where 56% households had no land whatsoever, and 90% households were without a single person who earned more than 10,000 rupees a month. Now, into this uh, rural hinterland, we have a huge mass of returning migrants, uh, and uh, and together, what is the future for them? Uh, and then there's the consequences of a pandemic amidst a totally broken health system. There are the social consequences of fear and scapegoating and discrimination. Uh, what will our scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, Muslim uh, brothers and sisters face? What will single women face? What will the aged face? What will children without care face? And probably worst of all, uh, persons with disabilities, what is going to happen to them in these times? Uh, the absence of any kind of social rights net, except thankfully NREGA and to some extent the PDS. Um, so how grave do you think this crisis is? What is its nature? What has brought us to the point, to this point? Uh, Really, I thought the first round, we would just talk about how 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 truly serious is the nature of this crisis, and what is its character. So may I request Prabhat firstly to come in and respond.
Thank you very much, Harsh. Thank you for having me on this panel. Uh, yes, I have no direct experience of the crisis of partition and the human suffering that that gave rise to. But to my mind, uh, in the entire period after independence, I have never seen anything like this in terms of the depth of the humanitarian crisis we are witnessing today. But even worse, that this particular crisis is sandwiched between a crisis which was already there, an economic crisis of the world economy, within which there was a crisis of India as well, which was already there even before the pandemic struck. For instance, we know that unemployment before the pandemic, unemployment estimates put it at a level higher than ever in the last 45 years. And what is worse, when the pandemic is over, well, if at all it is over, but suppose in some sense we limp back to a kind of normality, actually there would be some irreversible changes which would have been introduced into the economy and into our lives, which actually would mean the perpetuation or an accentuation of the crisis that had preceded it. Let me just give you an example, that the people who have gone back to the villages are obviously not going to have a level of income which is anywhere comparable to what they were having earlier. Uh, at least unless specific demands are made, specific movements are launched and so on, this is not going to happen. Now, to the extent it does not happen and they're not willing to go back to the cities, you'd find that actually their incomes would have gone down, demand would go down, and as a result, there would be an overall worsening of unemployment. So sometimes this feeling that we have that, all right, some people have left towns to go into the villages, but the total amount of employment in the economy is the same or would be the same as it was before the pandemic. That assumption itself is not right, because the very movement of people would also reduce the amount of employment that the economy would have, even if the specific pandemic caused unemployment is something which is done away with. Now, this is something which actually was affecting the lives of people in general pretty drastically even before the pandemic struck, and the pandemic, of course, has worsened it greatly. For instance, we know that per capita real consumption expenditure in rural India was 8% less per capita, 8% less in 2017-18 compared to what it had been in 2011-12. That's for all. That's just the average. Now, if that's true of the average, you can imagine how much worse it would be for Dalits, for women, for the marginalized groups. Therefore, we were in the, and 8% is a lot per capita, so we were really in the midst of a crisis even before that. So serious that the government actually suppressed the information relating to that particular NSS round. But in that, then the pandemic comes in, and this huge deurbanization, which would put even greater pressure on the rural economy. So we are in the midst of an absolute, real, serious humanitarian crisis. How we got there, which is the last question that you have. But I think essentially, in the world economy as well as in the Indian economy, in fact, in all the economies, major economies of the world, which reflects itself at the global level, there has been a very sharp increase in income inequality during the period of globalization. I would put this increase in income inequality somewhat differently. I would say that there has been a rise in the share of the economic surplus in the total output. By economic surplus, I mean all the property incomes you get and all the incomes of people who live off the property incomes, while the non-surplus is basically the wages and the incomes of the working people. Now, any such redistribution implies a reduction in demand. This is something because per unit income, the working people consume a lot more than the surplus earners. So every such redistribution implies a shift of a reduction in demand. At the world level, there was a reduction in demand, which was reflecting itself as well as the Indian economy is concerned. Within India, there has been such an increase in the share of the surplus, and therefore we were witnessing this very serious structural constraint on growth and structural crisis which was engulfing us. And on top of that, the pandemic has struck and has given rise to this very serious humanitarian problem.
Thank you, Prabhat. That's really sobering for you to say that after partition, this is probably the biggest humanitarian crisis that we are seeing, and that it's a crisis that already existed, on which the pandemic and on which the lockdown have piled on. Uh, uh, Gopal Guruji, are you there?
Yes, yes.
Gopal, so if you could please please see how you look at this moment in our history.
Thank you, Harsh, for inviting me to uh, converse with other experts on the very important issue. Broken economy and the future of social rights of the marginalized sections in this country. To respond to your first question, that is it really very vast in the history of crisis? Yes, definitely it is. As Prabhat has already rightly mentioned, as the crises which are humanitarian in nature. That is to say that it is actually affecting not only the economic, the political, the social, but most importantly, emotional stability of human being. Uh, Earlier, before the pandemic, people actually, as Prabhat has already pointed out, it is all accumulated. It is the manifestation of accumulated crisis in terms of unemployment, wages, economy. Now the manifestation has led to a kind of emotional depression of people, and that is why you find people do not want to stay back in the cities, and they are on the road, and their journey has been so tragic. So it actually is affecting all the important aspects, core aspects of human existence uh, in life. Uh, of course, there were crises. There were worst kind of crisis. 1972, 71, 72 drought situation actually really hit people very badly. Lower state of the society, and the food crisis, unemployment, and all that was there. But this is, I think, this different, and it is actually affecting not only economy but the entire structure, which actually will give you some guarantee to survive meaningfully in the society. Now, the most important point that I would like to share with you is the kind of inequality we had before pandemic was uh, was there, but as and when pandemic grew into its worst uh, degree, that the economy, the material suffering actually was replaced by the emotional insecurity of the people. And therefore, I think people, those who are in the street, working classes, were actually not caring for the material guarantee that the states were the states are offering to the people to stay back, and the opportunities will be opened up. They don't care, they're going back. And that is, I think, most important dimension of the pandemic crisis. So emotional, going back to the villages, staying very close to the intimate is the concern now. That only means that the civil society and the government in these cities has not cared much about these people, and they have actually been abandoned. So I think emotional depression has been very, very deep in the present crisis. That's one worst manifestation of the crisis. Now, when they go back to the village, as Prabhat has already said, there will be some kind of a pressure on the local opportunity structures. It will be very difficult for the local government. The local might become vocal, but the vocality is vacuous, I guess, because there is no infrastructure, there is no possibility of opportunities coming out at the local in the immediate future. So I will be there will be some kind of a disruption between the demand and supply at the local level as well, and therefore unemployment will always be there, and it cannot be taken care of immediately, and wage structure will always be a problem, and wages are going to be down, and they will not go up. And so that is one worrying part that the government or those who are actually thinking about restoring broken economy, they will have to think about it. So that is one challenge that is going to be there. And what else? The other problem, Harsh, you said? Other question?
No, what brought us to this point? Why? So, especially the psychosocial that you talked about, the collapse of faith. Why do you think we've
Yeah,
reached this point?
I, I think Prabhat has already mentioned that it is the insensitivity of the government to really respond to the crisis of unemployment uh, and uh, and respond to it immediately after it was actually uh, it actually was single. I mean, it was signaling. It was giving warning signals to all of us. At least getting into the action to really take care of all these workers could have been avoided actually, but that didn't happen. Now, sudden imposition of lockdown has really paralyzed the whole movement of people going. So that I think is one immediate consequences. But overall, the manifestation of the crisis, the pandemic, is not sudden. It is accumulated. The crises are accumulated, and therefore, I think we can actually go into uh, defining what were the crises, how were they maturing into a big crisis that we all know. But let me actually tell one thing about the what is the status of social rights in this pandemic now? That's the lead question that we have to raise. And can you really meaningfully talk about social rights? Can you really meaningfully read in them in terms of actually providing access to opportunity structures? And how and in the social actually what is important is to give the workers and the marginalized section of society employment that will restore their dignity back. But that doesn't happen, as you very rightly mentioned, that people have to queue up for a small portion of meal for 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and yet they when reach the end, they find there's no food available. So it's the kind of frustration and depression. It is much more morally so coercive and corrosive that 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 we have seen. So I think it is the accumulated crises that are manifested in a very disproportionate manner. So that's what I would like to say.
Thank you so much, Gopal. I think it's really important that you underline the psychosocial character of the crisis. You know, the complete breakdown of faith of our working poor on their government and also on middle class society, and the absence of any kind of hope, uh, the stripping of dignity. I think all of these are really crucial aspects. And the second point that you made was that this is cumulative. This is not something that has happened suddenly. It is really the outcome of a much longer breakdown of precisely these elements of social cohesion, which is trust and solidarity. Aruna, I can't see you. Are you around?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. So Aruna, if you could come in now, you're the closest in this panel to the realities in rural India. You're in Thilonia, and yeah, how does the crisis look to you from where you?
Harsh, you placed me at a very critical point of being one of the older members of this panel. And I was a year old when partition took place. And I don't know if Prabhat and I are the same age or we are 1 year apart from each other. But I happen to be in Delhi. Now, and I don't think even then, I mean, though memories are very, very vague and very hazy, but even in my younger age when I was a nursery school student and I was in primary school, the atmosphere around was one of hope. I mean, there wasn't this kind of complete lack of hope that we see today. And I do think it's been one of the worst crises because let me just go down a few things, and I agree with so many things that Gopal and Prabhat have said before me. But it is the callousness. Actually, people always hoped that that society and the state would not be as callous. It's this callousness that has really, I think, in one sense, that one cannot have any positive outcome of callousness. But what it has done is really taken away the scales from people's eyes. And to some degree, they've been able to see through the bombast, the propaganda, the hollow promises, and all those fatuous statements that have been made over time and again, time and again. And the caste composition has become very, very clear. So has the class composition. The kinds of callous remarks have been made about the migratory people, about them walking on the street, about their living there. How many of us have voluntarily gone out to feed anybody? How much of the population has really even thought of itself as obligated to give food, let alone anything else? You know, we are a minuscule lot who are really working very hard, but by and large, they are only seen as a utilitarian commodity of labor, of producing things, or what will happen when they leave. But the human condition has really bypassed most of India, and that's just for me one of the worst crises. Apart from the callousness, the it has actually removed the fig leaf, in other words, from what middle class thinks and what the state thinks. But if you look at their own position now, it's the fear of the unknown. Actually, we really don't know what's going to happen. See, when you know something's going to happen, then you get ready for it. We simply don't know sitting in rural India, except for NREG and the PDS. And that's why there's so much mobilization today in Rajasthan, because of continual lobbying with the state, the government, and continually meeting people. You know, I have been forbidden from going out because I'm over 70. But most of my friends are now actually back there with their masks or what is the sanitizers. They're going to NREGA work sites. We're mobilizing people. We're doing everything despite all the personal risks of, I don't know if there is really a personal risk, but whatever they may be. And what do we say now is that except for NREGA and all the well-known rights-based legislations we passed at some point of time, and the hope that the welfare state may function and we can force the government to deliver, there is nothing else. All the tools we knew that we could use, the only tools we are left with are what we've got out of the rights-based legislation. You can't mobilize, you can't speak out, you can't even project what is wrong in a big public forum, and the challenges have grown. We had we now are in a new kind of poverty, and this new kind of poverty is to be defined, and I think that's where we would really need the help of the theoretical members of this panel, because what is poverty? It can no longer be defined in older terms. Poverty today is completely different from the kind of poverty that we so easily identified, say, 30 years ago. So in that kind of new situation, our workers, Rajasthan has, of this 40 lakhs today, we have, many of them are migratory workers working on NREGA. We gave the largest workforce in northern India for construction work, apart from many others. So all these migratory workers are back now, and they do not see it. It's an irony, because migration was always seen as the last resort of joblessness, of unemployment. So when you are unemployed, you always say, okay, I'll migrate. You know, I'll go off to Jammu or to Delhi or to Bombay or to Ahmedabad or Gujarat or here or there, even to Karnataka and Kerala to earn money. But now migration is seen as a horror. So people are coming back. So the flip side of it is, now is the time to really build on Indian NREGA. Now is the time to really build on a rural economic agenda, and Prabhat has been talking about it, so has Vijayanand. I've heard both of them, and we also feel in the MKSS, it's a good time to expand the NREGA, to make this 100 mandatory days of work exist as they have always been, which is an entitlement, which is people-driven, which is, which creates assets for the people, but the rest of the days will have to be labor-centered. I mean, we can't again take them to bondage. We can't take them again to being part of a system where they are helpless, but that they have the option to opt for any other kind of work. Cottage industries. Maybe you have working on the agricultural farm. Chief Minister of Punjab has actually written to the Prime Minister today, saying that he wants NREGA to be allowed to work, people on NREG to be allowed to work on agricultural work, because he says otherwise Punjab's entire agricultural work will just collapse. So if so, on what terms? Does the worker actually opt to work, or do they get mandated to work in a particular place without an option of change? But if they do that, then it's a labor camp, if you use modern language. If you use our ancient system, then they are bonded, and that we don't want. So it's a very, very good time, and I think I'm very glad that there's Harsh, and there's Prabhat, there's Jayati, and there's Gopal, and there's Vijayanand, that we can all sit together and brainstorm to see how exactly these new systems are going to function. And I think it's a very good time. We also need an urban employment guarantee, about which again, I think all of us have mentioned before, we've all agreed. But we'll also probably have to think of the NDNRG as it is today, to go into D and C class municipalities, which are really small towns. They call themselves small towns, but they live like villages. So from the hinterland, maybe they can draw people. We prevent these large-scale migration to metropolises, They go and work in the hinterland in these small kasbah towns, which we call kasbah towns in northern India, these small towns. And there they can get employment uh, in small production factories. And self-employment should become a very important thing, including people who push these handcarts. You know, people who are hawkers. People, all this should be seen as self-employment. And I think a whole range of new possibilities will emerge. And I think it's a time we must all push, because this push will take us into a place where we can re-establish all that we have lost, possibly in the last so many years. And of course, the labor laws, if we do not bring that into the center of our debate, we lose everything. So we'll have to reclaim and fight for labor laws. And today, more important than even bargaining power is fighting for basic social and economic rights. And social rights and economic rights are vitally important. And today it's Eid. So Eid Mubarak to all of you. It is an important day for all of us to re-establish that we will not bring in the communal agenda. We will not bring in the communalization, not only of COVID, but communalization of everything else we know, of Narega, of food security, of hawkers. People are not buying from people who are Muslims. The first thing that we've been doing in Barmer is to ask the name of the individual selling vegetables. Because if you have a Muslim name, they're not buying vegetables from you. So we have a lot of work ahead, but I think it's not in the nature of an activist to lose hope. So I think the NPSS has been madly trying to see what else it can do and how it can work it. Because if we lose hope and sit down, then it's the final victory of people who want us completely destroyed, or the ideas that we all hold together completely destroyed. So we have to fight back. So I'll stop now at this optimistic note that we must and have to fight back. And the question only is how.
Thank you so much, Aruna. You know, what you said at the earlier part of your presentation, I remember conversations with you about your childhood memories of just after partition. And you did say it was a time of hope. You also said it was a time when people with great dignity, rebuilt their lives in very difficult circumstances. And maybe the latter part of what you were saying was about, which is really what we'll come back to in the third part of the discussion today, is what do we do in the future? How do we help rebuild with hope and with dignity? And I think those are very important questions as well. May I bring in Patrick at this stage? Patrick's been one of the most sort of perceptive scholars of Indian society from a distance. How do you see and understand the crisis? Of course, you have the crisis in America to compare with, and it would be interesting to see how do you see the crisis in India? How does it compare with what you see around in the United States?
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you to the Center for organizing this extraordinary panel. And let me just say how honored I am to be part of this amazing conversation. Yeah, I would make 4 general points, all of which are somewhat comparative. It's been said that this pandemic is a physical exam of the social body. What it's done in India, as it has in the United States and other countries with deep-seated inequalities, such as Brazil, is it's really laid bare just how deep those fault lines are. And tragically, it's amplified all of those fault lines. So be it the fault lines of class or caste or community, what this pandemic is doing is exasperating those deep-seated inequalities, including the structural economic inequalities that Prabhat already talked about. And what worries me is that beyond the immediate effects, the loss of livelihoods, the hunger, the desperation, are the long-term effects. Because if there's one thing we know about inequality, is that it's cumulative. So children who are deprived of nutrition today will suffer in the future from stunting. Children who don't go to school, and this is a problem here in the United States as well, the middle class can learn from home and has the resources to manage this crisis. The working class is being adversely impacted on any number of fronts. The being cut off from educational opportunities, the livelihood impact, et cetera. So it's difficult to exaggerate the long-term cumulative effects of the pandemic on inequality. The second point I would make is that this crisis has exposed underlying institutional weaknesses. And as we look across the world, some countries have had more effective responses and some have had very ineffective responses. And the difference really lies in the degree to which existing institutions can provide social protection and welfare. And so some of the responses in Northern Europe in particular have been relatively successful, but in countries that already had weak institutional capacity and relatively weak welfare states, we're seeing the effects amplified. And even within India, the impact is much more dramatic in the north than it is in the south, and Mr. Vijayanand no doubt can talk to us a little bit about Kerala, which is at least a source of some optimism in these really difficult times. And those institutional weaknesses are having absolutely debilitating effects, because as Aruna and as Harsh have already underscored, there's a loss of faith in public institutions. And again, here the comparative differences are striking. The response in Kerala, which has been so successful, not only in flattening the curve, but also addressing the welfare crisis, is a response that's been built on the strength of people's trust in public action and public institutions and faith in political leadership. In most of the rest of the country, quite the opposite has happened. Given the callousness and the indifference of the government, people are losing faith in institutions. And once you lose that trust, it's incredibly difficult to rebuild trust. And so that's a very big concern as well. And then the final point I'd simply underscore is this is also turning out to be a crisis of democracy. And I'll say a little bit more about this later, but in the United States and in Brazil, as bad as the crisis has been, at least it has triggered some political pushback. With upcoming elections in the United States, there's at least some hope in a change of regime. And Bolsonaro is finding himself in a very deep political crisis because of his response to the pandemic. In India, the central government has taken advantage of this crisis to double down on its repression of civil society. And again, that amplifies the problem of trust, but also what it simply does is undermine the overall capacity of the state to provide a coordinated response to this crisis. And this isn't just a crisis of the immediate moment, of course, it's a crisis that's going to be with us for years. And without some coordinated approach from the center, it's difficult to see how the worst of the welfare effects will ever be addressed. And the long-term erosion in faith in democratic institutions and principles is something that's really extremely alarming.
Thank you, Patrick. I think I agree with every word. The crisis I mean, it has shown a pandemic in an highly unequal society. It only exacerbates those inequalities. Your caution that these inequalities and the consequences of it will last across generations is something I hadn't thought of as clearly as you said it, and I think that is even more worrying, that it's not long after this crisis passes, people who have suffered injustice at this moment are going to bear the consequences of it for a long time. You're reminded about the loss of faith in institutions. and in democratic institutions will also last for a long time. And I think that's a truly worrying aspect of the crisis. And thank you for bringing these in. I'll call in Jayati now, please. You've heard a lot. What is your reflection on what really is the gravity and the nature of our crisis?
Yeah, thank you, Harsh. I completely agree with everything that's been said. This is absolutely by far the gravest crisis I've certainly experienced, and certainly the gravest crisis I believe in independent India. And it is going to be something which has very, very severe effects, as Patrick said, as Prabhat said, over the medium term. It's not something that is going to go away tomorrow, day after, no matter what the government response is. I think people have already made a lot of the important points. I just want to add one thing, that none of this was really so necessary. And I think that's very important. We're constantly being told that the pandemic has done it. No, the pandemic has not done it. The government response has done it. We did not have to have such a brutal lockdown imposed at 4 hours notice. No other country did that. Our neighbors all gave a week's notice, 5 days notice, 10 days notice. We could have actually enabled migrants to go back. We could have informed people that this was going to happen. We could have done it more gradually. Even if we wanted to do it at once, we could have given sufficient advance notice to state governments, to the people in general, to allow them to make some kind of arrangement. We could have warned them that they're going to lose all their income for at least a month, possibly longer, which is what actually the government was thinking and knew full well when it said 3 weeks that it was going to be longer and so on. We did not have to create the kind of humanitarian catastrophe that we have done. Because by doing that, not only have we generated an economic depression of an unprecedented proportion, which is going to take massive, massive public expenditure to generate any kind of recovery, but we've also created a worsening public health situation. If we had allowed migrants to go back earlier, we would not have the kind of massive spread of infection that we're now seeing across the hinterland and in states that really don't have health infrastructure. In Bihar, in Uttar Pradesh, and so on, the rates of increase of infection are so rapid now, and they're going to be spreading to villages where there is really no health facility to speak of. So we've kind of destroyed it on both levels. The state action has actually damaged the economy in massively, but it has also added to the public health disaster. And I think it's important to note that it was not necessary. It's a critical thing because we keep saying it's an act of God, if you like, it's a pandemic. No, it was the policy response that did it. The next thing I just want to point out is this whole issue of the migration, the massive distress migration that we've seen, the forced migration, and the general discussion in the mainstream media is all about, will they come back? Will we get the people to do our construction activities? Will our manufacturing be able to? And so it's all around that, and the overall attitude seems to be, which comes, I think, from the deep inequality that Prabhat mentioned and the deep caste and class discrimination that is so embedded in our society. The attitude seems to be that if you make things rough enough for them wherever they are, they will come back. They'll have no option. And they will be forced to work on whatever terms because that is, finally they'll have to survive. Now, it is true that there might be some element of that in the short term because things are going to be bad in the villages, even with an expansion of NREG, even with, and at the moment, I can't even see that the government will allow much of an expansion. They have only brought up the expenditure to the level that it was supposed to be at the beginning of this financial year. That our estimate of the requirement was 102 lakh crore. Okay, so already, it was, they haven't really put out sufficient money for NREG for the rest of the year. So we don't know whether it will genuinely expand. And clearly, it's going to be an extremely deep depression in both rural and urban India for the foreseeable future. If the government does not spend, and at the moment, again, there is no indication that it will spend, okay? Actually, the fiscal stimulus is not 1% of GDP, which is what everyone is saying. It's actually negative. I think this, everyone has to get this in their heads. The central government is not allowing state governments to spend. State governments are constrained by the tax revenues they can raise. They will not be able to increase their spending beyond a point. What they could possibly do is shift some money around here to there. Over the period, their spending will fall. There is every indication that the central government also intends to let its expenditure more or less respond to the fact that its tax revenues are coming down. So, in fact, the fiscal stimulus may well be negative for this economy, not positive. We are therefore looking at a major contraction. Now, in that kind of a situation, honestly, I think all predictions are up for grabs. You know, I don't think we are in a position to know what this level of distress does for a society, for a polity, because we have never experienced, I don't think, this level of distress. Maybe Bengal famine, but again, it was localized relatively. We are going to see such unimaginable distress that I really do not think that even the government can anticipate fully. Even their attempts to control dissent right now, lock up a number of people who were engaged in peaceful protest, who were trying to uphold the constitution, etc. Those attempts also may not be adequate to meet the kind of complete chaos which is likely to emerge from such a major destruction of the economy. So I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but I really think that this was a man-made catastrophe, and I say men advisedly, it was men who did it. It was a man-made catastrophe. It was not generated by a virus. It is being worsened by policy actions of the government at present, and it is leading to outcomes that I think we simply cannot anticipate because they're so extreme.
Jayati, and I can't again agree with you more. I wanted to underline that it's not just the outcome of public policy choices that have been made now. It is also the outcome of public policies that have made in the past.
Exactly.
And really, three most important ones, I think. One of them is the the complete destruction of whatever public health system we had.
Yes.
I think that is one for consequence. I mean, if 80% of doctors work in the private sector, 80% of the 66% of beds are in the private sector, and they've completely stopped contributing at this point of time. And I was reading that 2/3 of the districts don't have a single testing facility. 2/3 of the districts. That's where the virus is going to spread. So these are public policy choices that we made in the past. Our unwillingness to give any kind of social rights and labor rights to the large mass of the working poor is the second segment, and the third is the huge gaps that we've left in our food security arrangements. I mean, I think that these are public policy failures of the past, and now the choice of the lockdown. All of them have created, and it is man-made and and terrifying for that reason. Vijayanand, I don't know, how you're going to come into this discussion. We do want to know about Kerala, and we do want to learn from it at latter parts of this discussion. But just in terms of the crisis, you also have a lot of workers in Kerala, and just even through their eyes, how do you see this crisis?
One thing which I can say is that it's been a rapid downward spiral, pulling in more sectors of development, more people, more areas, and nobody knows where it's going. It's worsening, though in outward figures it may not look so bad. And all in a situation of economic decline, not spree, joblessness, growing inequality, not only of wealth, income, but also of influence and power, and avoidable socio-political tension. So in my young days, we had learned of the ratchet effect of different factors of poverty. Now this is working in the whole economy, the whole ratchet effect, and is pulling it down. That's my impression. And how did we reach there? I thought I'll spend a couple of minutes on that. As was mentioned, delayed response. People have not highlighted that. We're talking about Kerala. On 12th of January, Kerala alerted its rapid response force. 12th of January. And here we come and middle of February. And 2 months for a nation. Everybody talks about war. It's too much.
25th March.
Yes,
25th
26th
March.
March, but they started speaking around 15th March. Then sudden lockdown has been mentioned. And in a recent webinar, Professor Abhijit Sen said, we announce, then think, and then plan. That seems to be the new sequence. That is extremely dangerous. And something which I've been noticing in government, I could even see it before 2014 also, equitable development is not in the political intellectual discourse. And even asking for basic rights, you look like a mad fellow. And the sole focus these days, even Kerala got into the bandwagon briefly without forgetting its other aspects, ease of doing business. So that is our sole focus. And then, as you mentioned, neglect of human development, public health. And just imagine the suggestion of Niti Aayog that your district hospitals be privatized. Talking of district hospitals, it's not that we have capacity, we had capacity. But if you have the essential infrastructure, you can ramp up the capacity. When Nipah struck Kerala, Kerala did not have a single lab in the whole state. We had to go all the way to Pune. And within 1 month of COVID, 18 centers have started, 16 of them in public sector. So if government wants, with limited resources, you can. That's a big lesson from Kerala. Not that Kerala is one of the most fiscally. And something which is worrying is the informalization of the labor relations. And I would blame the trade unions also. They are focusing on the organized permanent workers and not on the contract labor. And Manisha is still rings a bell. And another thing which is recently happening is the forced so-called formalization of the informal economy through technology and tax, and not through building capacity, skilling, and diversifying. So it's a very artificial kind of formalization which has rattled the MSME. I can see it even in Kerala. Then, of course, total weakening of the labor laws and social protection, and the public's. And another thing which is a recent, very recent thing, probably best revealed in the FM's speeches these days, we have equated public sector reform to privatization. It's an extreme step. Earlier we thought we'll impress competition and all those things were there. Now nothing, it's there. And what is even worrying, failure of the guardian institutions, Human Rights Commission, SC Commission, and then judicial activism is almost dead, especially vis-a-vis government and vis-a-vis poor persons' rights. And another thing which has not been followed, I've worked in plan for a long time. Killing the plan was suicide. Suicide. SCSP, TSP, minorities, persons with disabilities, they're all linked to the plan. Planning was nothing great in India for a long time. But at least there could be some discussion on what are the priorities, some data coming up, knowing where the weaknesses lie, that we have lost. And another important thing, which India has no local governance system, except Kerala, to some extent or not. West Bengal is not that well rooted. And then, of course, you mentioned it, shrinking space of civil society and independent media. And worse is class interests can be killed through communal interest. It's extremely dangerous. And where will we go? At least at this time, I thought there will be a movement for workers, movement for labor, movement for the poor. But then you forget that essential human thing and go back to a very primitive kind of split. That's all the points I want to make at this point.
Vijayanand, all of that very, very useful. How did we come here through a whole set of failures, well beyond the three that I had listed, and thank you. The second question, and I find that we spent a lot of time on the first quite rightly. The second is an easy one, which is how do you evaluate what the government has done? And I propose that we go through it much faster, because the last part of the discussion is really what you feel needs to be done. So maybe a quick, more rapid fire kind of round on what do you think, how do you evaluate the government's economic package, its attempts to rebuild the economy? Prabhat?
Well, the government has literally done nothing by way of rebuilding the economy. In fact, Jayati is quite right. If anything, its impact would be negative. That basically, when you look at the package, much of it is simply credit offers, making credit available to various sectors. Now, Keynes had a remark earlier. He said that you can truncate a boom either through a shortage of demand or through a shortage of credit. But you cannot, but for truncating a slump, you require both, not either. So in the absence of demand, if you simply make a credit offer, you would not even have takers of the credit. As a result, what the government has done really is something which amounts to nothing. If you look at the total amount which the government is, in all its various pronouncements, which the government is making available through fiscal means, it comes to less than 1% or just about 1% of the GDP. The whole idea now is to stimulate demand, and the government seems almost to be unaware of it. Or even if they are aware, they're too afraid of credit rating agencies and global finance to be able to do anything about it.
Yeah. So, Gopal ji?
Thanks. So the response has been very meager, I would say, in terms of reaching out to people, providing facilities to the people. What we have to understand is the structural infirmities that cannot be rectified by the government. For example, in Mumbai, slums are so much saturated and congested that intervening there with some promise of medicine and health services becomes absolutely difficult. So what happens, unfortunately, is that it is not the government, it is the people who are held responsible for the worsening of the crisis. So in a way, very they say discursively, the responsibility is being individualized. It is not the government, but the individuals who are responsible. They are not keeping social distancing, they are not following rules and all that. So, and therefore, I think to really, there's a lack of rationality among the people. Therefore, you have to bring rationality from outside through police and other mechanism. So I think this is a bit of a difficult issue. I mean, how to understand, how to evaluate the performance of the government is also tied up with the responsibility of the people. But all said and what is important in this regard is to see that the government is not acknowledging that it has certain structural limitations to handle the crisis in terms of conducting phase, in terms of providing infrastructure, in terms of actually regulating food and other medicinal facilities to the people. So there is a problem with the government, no doubt about it. But the real problem is that the government is not able to actually comprehend the way it has to really reach out to the people and confront the crisis. For example, if there's one person calling from a house and the government doctor is going, he finds 70 people waiting for the treatment. That is it's a very dicey situation in a way. So I think it's really it's very difficult to really make a very final comment on the assessment of the government.
Yeah. I mean, in simpler words, the government seems pretty clueless that whether it is on the economic or on the health. I mean, I really find them, saying one thing one day, saying the opposite thing another day.
Yes.
And seeming a completely confused apart from everything else. Aruna, would you like to just do a quick evaluation of what the government has?
Quickly, of course, unemployment is one huge thing which they've done nothing about. What the money that they've given the NREGA has just, as Jayati said, appears much more than it really is. But the point is that the push from below is so hard now that there's something giving in, at least in the state government levels. Let's see how far it goes, but it's not a great promise. We have to fight for employment. Let's look at food security. What about those 77 million tons of food grains? What have we got? Only 8 crore migrant workers have got 5 kilos each. It's a laugh. What have we got?
1 million tons out of the 77 million tons.
Out of the 77 million tons. So where is the food security? Why can't they distribute food to people who are hungry and unemployed? And there's no possibility of employment really, full employment. So I think you take that and you take health. They're not getting attention. Even COVID patients or possible COVID patients, there's no testing, and normal natural illnesses are causing deaths in the villages because people are not able to access health. So we really need to look at a national health service. We really need to look at all these fundamental basic things that they're not getting. I'm not even going to schooling, which is such a huge disaster. Children have all lost one whole year because they can't do digital education. They can't do digital exams. Most of the children can't access them. So they've really lost a year, and I don't know what else they've lost. So I really think one great fear that we all have and had, which is that this kind of new attitude of the state, of the government, to every single issue is going to set us back to begin fighting at the baseline for our basic rights. And then it thrusts us back there. So I think if you look at food, health, literacy, education, we are back almost to square one in many cases. So I think that I would really say is what's worrying people in the villages the most.
Patrick, your evaluation?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the key points have already been made. So let me just quickly put this into some comparative perspective. The obvious countries that one would want to compare India to are the United States and Brazil. Those are the two other very large federal democracies. And all three are currently governed by regimes that have clear autocratic tendencies. And I think one of the lessons of all of this is that autocratic regimes are terrible at dealing with crises like this, and for a number of reasons. I mean, first, they have tunnel vision. They speak mostly to their supporters, which and have a lack of empathy. So the response has not been one driven by empathy and a sense of solidarity. It's been driven by short-term, narrow political calculations of playing to your base. And we've seen that with Trump and Bolsonaro and with the center in India. There's a lack of willingness to work with subnational governments, and more than anything else, the lack of coordination preceding the lockdown was catastrophic. Not consulting with chief ministers before locking down the economy was pure madness. Well, likewise in the United States, Trump has had a completely hostile attitude to governors and has even tried to assert authorities that he doesn't have. And Bolsonaro has literally accused governors in Brazil who have tried to address the pandemic as being communists and banditos, you know, the Brazilian version of urban Naxalites, basically. So the great, you know, for those who had any kind of illusions that authoritarian regimes are better at handling crises, I would hope that they are now completely disillusioned by just how irresponsible and ineffective these increasingly autocratic regimes have been. As I said earlier, though, the one silver lining in the United States and in Brazil is that neither Trump nor Bolsonaro control the legislature, and they haven't been able to repress civil society. So Brazil has actually pushed through a basic income grant that's quite generous at the behest of civil society through the legislature. And the United States is doing something I'd never thought I'd see in my adult life. It's actually reconverting itself to Keynesianism and trying to prime pump the economy. And again, largely because of the Democrats. Unfortunately, in India, Modi has near hegemonic powers at the central level, and so there's really no pushback, and that to me is more worrisome than anything else.
Yeah, wow. Jayati?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think Prabhat already highlighted the sheer macroeconomic stupidity so far, and of course the meaninglessness of this so-called big package, the Atmanirbhar Abhiyan or whatever package. I just want to pick up, just to add to that, what is so evident throughout this 2-month period has really been very, very striking. The sheer caste, class, and gender bias of this government. Every single action, the class differentiation has been so evident.
Yeah.
Whether it is the way you welcome migrants from abroad and how you deal with migrants within your country, attitude to plane travel vis-a-vis train travel, attitude to how people are supposed to do so-called social distancing and the norms that you're supposed to comply with, the implications for women, the way you treat your frontline workers, your Anganwadi workers and ashas without providing them any protection whatsoever, and how of course the government, and in turn taking a cue from that, society takes all of that for granted, does not factor in any of the concerns that women particularly would have, whether in imposing particular policies or in how you propose to treat the pandemic. I think what has really been striking is how open, blatant, and explicit it has been, which I think is unlike pretty much every other country. At least everywhere else, you're trying to hide it a little bit. Here, it's now out there, open. And of course, we're the only country that has successfully managed to give the virus a religious flavor, right? We've communalized the virus as well. So I think in addition to the macroeconomic stupidity, because it is stupid, they will themselves regret this lack of spending now. There is this feeling that now you can get away with anything. You can be the way you actually are. The gloves are off. You don't have to pretend anymore. You are an upper caste, patriarchal, upper class government, and you're going to behave that way.
Wow. Vijayanand?
Yeah. Just as I heard 3-4 days back, somebody, government spokesman, making a theory out of this, saying that we did consciously avoided strengthening demand and something else is there, but nobody has taken pains to explain how this 20 lakh will stream out into the economy. It's common sense, even ideologically you tell, but nobody has done it. So that's quite shocking when you're announcing 20 lakhs and you're not able to say what they expect to reach where. And in an emergency, basic thing is you spend on your immediate needs. And here it's a health need. There is no kind of estimating what is required. We all have done it for simple floods, estimating what is and compensating who are spent. It is a mandate under NDRF, under the National Disaster Management Act, not being touched. Some 50,000 crore, 15,000 crore was announced, but details I couldn't see so far. Then states, as was mentioned by Patrick, you have not taken them into trust. They have spent most of the money. Health is a state responsibility. You have allowed them to borrow with conditions. For the first time in history, it goes against fiscal federalism. And conditions are which you impose. And state is borrowing from the market, not from the RBI, at market rates and going to repay from its own revenues. So that condition, and no grants to states. And SHGs, self-help groups, could have been a big source. It was a bogus thing that without collateral you can borrow 20 lakhs. They're not even getting 1 lakh. So had some 2,000 rupees loan been given to SHGs members, that itself would have boosted, because women are wise spenders in times of crisis. And India now has 6.8 million SHGs. Nothing for agriculture. Fortunately, that's the only sector which is more or less unscathed. Though prices are low, it is not collapsed. Everything else has collapsed. But something which should have gone for agriculture, it has not gone. They're only paying what they had promised earlier to farmers. So many things could be done in agriculture. And this government is known for its public works. And no additional public work in rural areas or urban areas. At least we should have absorbed the construction sector. So agriculture and construction, which provide the bottom thing for employment, has not been touched. And of course, it's a belief I was 2 years in Delhi, the belief is that social security is a private function of the family and society and not a public function. That was also done. And all of us have welcomed Narega, but it is only 40,000 crores in cash. No labor budget revision, no inclusion of new workers, and no assurance that 100 days will be given. That alone is required. I'm not asking for more than 100. Government will say, if 100 is required, we will give 100 and consider later. That assurance is not there. Some money is there. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you. The most important part of the conversation really is what do you think needs to be done. I know that it's a bit like talking, in the air when you know that we're having a government of the kind that Jayati described so clearly, and it's completely unlikely to listen to any of this. But we do have state governments, and I do think as the crisis deepens, there will be a desperation to look for answers. And I think we need to have faith and think very carefully about what needs to be done. And so really what needs to be done vis-a-vis rebuilding the economy with equity, what we do for restoring social rights and labor rights, what do we do with regard to the health crisis, and I think some of the whole psychosocial crisis that Gopal spoke about and others, the political crisis as well of democracy that Patrick spoke about. Uh, what do we do about all of these? It's going to be a tough one, but because we have to go around, and I really would value, all of us would value listening to all of you. So if you could pick 3 or 4 critical things, and if you hear somebody saying it before you, then you could come on to something else. Dealing with the economic crisis, the whole question of social and labor rights, the health pandemic extending now into the countryside, which has no facilities whatsoever of testing, tracing, and cure, and the larger social and political collapse of faith in institutions, of the independence of institutions, of democracy, of communal sort of targeting, of gender, violence growing, and marginalization. It's a huge, it is a huge unprecedented crisis. We need to think, and really, what would be the 3 things each of you would say that we need to do? Possibly, Prabhat, would you like to start?
I agree that the government is going to do nothing of the sort that we would be talking about here. But on the other hand, it's very important to actually establish what is possible, in which case you can actually have people demanding it. Jayati is absolutely right about the extreme open class caste bias of the government, patriarchal bias of the government. In fact, I would say the government which is very strongly moving in a fascist direction, and the idea would be to actually suggest an alternative around which then people can be mobilized. Jayati and I did a calculation which actually says that if you have just 2% tax on the wealth of the top 1% of the country's population, and an accompanying inheritance tax that actually takes away 1/3 of what is bequeathed every year, then you'd be able to generate 10% of the total GDP as expenditure, and that would be quite enough to finance 5 basic rights: the right to food, employment, healthcare, free publicly funded healthcare, free publicly funded education, and to pensions. So the point is that fiscally it is possible for us to have an alternative. And what is more, of course, once you have this alternative, then the nature of development itself would have to be different. I think, given the fact that large numbers of people have gone back to the countryside, this may be actually a good time to think in terms of an alternative development strategy that doesn't believe in shifting large numbers of people from the villages to the towns in order to give them employment, but rather to bring employment to them where they are. So, and that's perfectly possible. That's perfectly possible with rural enterprises, small scale enterprises, the kind of enterprises that in China you had, the township and village enterprises and so on. We could think of a completely different strategy that is actually based on rapid growth of the agricultural sector. We think in terms of export-led industrialization as being synonymous with exporting to other countries. But what about industry exporting to agriculture? In which case agricultural output has to be sufficiently enlarged. So you'd have to have the rights, you'd have to have an alternative pattern of development. It is fiscally possible. It has to be made socially and politically possible, and that can be done only by mobilizing the people around an alternative against the kind of policy that are being pursued. In other words, the feasibility, social and political, is not something we should be worrying about its existence. We have to create the feasibility.
Absolutely. And the challenge of doing that in times of authoritarian lockdowns and social distancing and the breakdown of of even existing social solidarities of the kind that we saw, and a completely enfeebled opposition. But it is the people of India, I think, that have to rise to this. Gopal, what were the three things that you would stress?
Harsh, I think in terms of the alternative framework to deal with the crisis, the immediate thing is to really, as people are suggesting, is to give money to the people so that they can survive immediately and they do not really push them into some kind of a deeper depression and frustration. That's point one. So I think money going into the hands of people is one immediate, urgently required task. Second, and we have been saying that, you require to really achieve a development, even development with equity, justice, and dignity, all that. That means you'll have to start from the local village where you have enough opportunities where people can really find their job, meaningful job. So it may not really lead to some kind of a displaced migration. Now we have seen the impact of displaced migration. Actually, cities being crowded by migration, and people actually allow cities to be crowded as long as this crowd really helps to accumulate more profit. So that there is actually some kind of a politics of allowing people to come into the cities, but not looking at an even development. So that's the skewed development that we have in this country. Point two is that, what kind of equity you want to achieve in the future. I mean, or to put it cynically, what kind of inequality you will have to have in future. As it's going to be, for example, pandemic has done some kind of a leveling impact. The social basis of inequality and equality has been expanded across caste. Now, earlier you had only the Dalits working in the sanitation and sewage system, and the tragic days taking place every time. This time you find that because of the loss of employment, people from other castes are also coming and doing their job. Now they also have attach a very different meaning. Now it is really below the dignity to do this. I mean, they are not sensitive about others' dignity. Okay.
I think Gopal, you're a little frozen. Are you?
No, I am. Is it? Let me see.
Okay, yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just refresh it. So I think what would be the nature of this equality or inequality in the future? If you really want to have equality, you have to remove these spaces of opportunities which are actually dirty spaces like scavenging and all that, so that no one is actually pushed beyond the human worth. No one is actually treated as below the human worth. So that is much longer plan of action. It's not immediate policy matter now. It's a long time process where you have to actually. I would like to quote for the discussion that what is this entitlement? I think entitlement word had come in the discussion earlier. Now Lockean, the John Locke's, there's a debate as Prabhat and others. This debate between this debate between John Locke and Robert Nozick. An entitlement issue has been at the core of the debate, at the center of the debate. Now, in our country, what is entitled? What is an entitlement? Having actually right to clean somebody's shit is your entitlement. Is it your entitlement? And so I think Locke would say you soil with when you are mixing your labor with soil, you get your right, you get your entitlement. But here, the Dalits are actually mixing their labor with night soil. Is that an entitlement? How are you going to change this in the future? Is the lead question, I think. And so I think the cumulative impact of injustice, inequality, has to be taken into consideration while you are actually planning for a long-term remaking of the economy. The other point I would like to make is that in the pandemic, technology has actually not resolved the question of inequality. Actually, it has deepened the question of inequality. For example, education. If you want to conduct classes or online classes, you require conditions to access those classes. But for that conditions, you require electricity, you require Wi-Fi, you require everything there. Then only you can meaningfully get into the mode. But that is not that you're talking about. So that inequality is actually inbuilt into a vision of the technology, the technological development. All this we have to actually think in order to really create some kind of equity in the future. The last point, Harsh, I would make is about the injustice question. Now, injustice actually is you are in a way it's intergenerational injustice. It's not generational justice. Like you are actually handing over injustice from one generation to another generation. That is to say, people from certain castes are actually there in the scavenging and other sanitary work for generations together. Now they have established their entitlement. They don't allow other people tragically to enter this thing. Now, if this is the development, economic development you want to achieve, I think this is not along the egalitarian, normative, dignified way of talking your planning your economy. I think these are three very important issues that we have to think whenever you are planning for better economy or a reformulated economy.
No, absolutely. The social aspects of equality. Aruna, what were the three things you'd
I would say that the most critical thing today is to mobilize the people who have mobilized and got huge benefits for all of us in the past have been the working class, the workers, women who've been at the worst end of every single stick. So today we need to go back to the migrants, we have to go back to the workers, and we have to look at new forms of unionization to fight against all these restrictions on labor, the various other ways in which they've been, their entire life's work for many of them has been nullified. We have to also fight somewhere for mobility. The worst thing that has happened to us today, that we're all trapped, and I'm amazed at how quietly we have all gone into our little nest. None of us is questioning whether this COVID really is such a huge, horrible phenomenon that we all have to give up all sense of mobility And this Arogya Setu has now become an absolutely impossible, absolute compulsion, because otherwise you can't travel. You can't get into a train, you can't get into a plane, and any bookings you want to do anywhere asks for an Arogya Setu. So I think this control of our mobility through various systems is something which affects all of us, from the poorest worker to anybody else. So I think mobilization, mobility, and another part of that whole syndrome is that we have to look at methods of self-sufficiency now in our local areas. That's why NREGA and the local fights are critical, because we can begin them today. So you look at your self-sufficiency in employment, you look at your self-sufficiency in food, you look at various things which you can start trying to quarrel for and fight immediately. And then you build the larger dreams, but those have to be immediate dreams. We also, all of us, have to look at transparency as a very important right we all got, which has been corroded from the PM Care, which has now gone completely under wrap, and even the CAG can't look at what's happening with the PM Care fund and PM Cares or PM Care. To the last thing that's happening with us in our own areas, everything is going into areas of complete oblivion, where we can't really get any information out. So that transparency and information battle somehow comes into the center of the NREGA, center of the demand for attention to health, center of the demand for everything, and we have to get back to that somehow or the other. And we also need to know what the governments are planning for us. You know, some kind of complete miasma and blindness. We really don't know what's happening. And that is the most fearful thing. And I think we'll have to start demanding that the plans must be put in the public domain, part of our transparency campaigns, but also bringing back the whole notion of a federal system, of consulting people, and also of the notion of bringing in the notion of a welfare state, the notion of a planned economy. There's so many things that follow when you start bringing the debate into the public domain, but what are the solutions? But at the heart of it is the person who is suffering the most, is the worker, the woman, and the person who has lost everything because of these extraordinary circumstances on which they were given 4 hours to wrap up and go, the millions who have been stranded, and they will have to tell us, and we'll have to start listening to them. The challenge for all of us is, how do we get to listen to them when we are all isolated and absolutely forbidden to move? So mobility and mobilization, I would say, are critical factors just now immediately for public action.
Perfect, Patrick. And again, taking a larger international perspective.
Yeah, well, I want to build directly on Aruna's comments. I mean, I think we all understand that rights, the effectiveness of rights, depend on two things. On the one hand, it depends on the capacity of individuals and collectives to mobilize, to claim their rights, to demand their rights. On the other hand, it depends on the capacity of the state at all levels, from the center all the way to the local, to respond to those rights and to make those rights actionable. And so the meta narrative here has to be about strengthening, rebuilding, and rescaling institutions. And I would say 4 things, if you'll allow me, Harsh, 4 things have to happen. Decentralize, 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 decentralize. And I mean 4 different things. So first, to Prabhat's point, you know, the Indian economy is spatially incredibly uneven. It's overly concentrated in large metros. We know those are unsustainable socially, environmentally, and in terms of inclusion. And so India needs a much more deconcentrated, decentralized economy with more local economic development. The center has to decentralize to the states. As Vijayanand said, it's the states that manage the line departments that have to deliver both the health and other services that will be required to address the welfare consequences of the pandemic, which is indeed, as Jayati says, man-made. States themselves have to decentralize to panchayats and municipalities. Those are the key points at which the various rights and services and public actions have to be coordinated. And if those local governments don't have the resources and the capacity and the authority to coordinate line department interventions, you'll never have an effective coordinated response to the pandemic or the capacity to build local welfare institutions. And, you know, as everyone who's been following the case of Kerala knows, and as Vijayanand has already emphasized, it's really the strength of local panchayats and municipalities more than anything else that has allowed Kerala to mobilize so effectively in crushing the curve and addressing the welfare crisis. And then the fourth and final decentralized point is India probably has the weakest frontline state in the world. I mean, just in terms of boots on the ground and the kind of resources and authority and decision-making capacity of the frontline state, of the nurses, the Anganwadis, of the local public actors. There has to be a massive investment in the frontline state. And this is a win-win. It generates employment, but it also generates the kind of labor-intensive services that an effective welfare state requires, but both to deal with the pandemic, the surveillance systems, the contact tracing, the building up of local health capacity, but also of building out the new welfare infrastructure that's going to be required to address the problems of inequality and poverty and injustice that we've all been focusing on.
Jayati, I know you have to go as well, so just, yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Harsh. You know, I think all the important points have been made already. So I'm just going to use this time to answer some of the questions that have come in, specifically on something that I said about how the government's fiscal stimulus this year is actually going to be negative, not positive. And I think that needs to be explained a little bit. I didn't say that the package that she announced implied negative spending. But what I do still believe is that what is going to happen over the course of the year is that in all likelihood, this government is actually going to spend less than it did last year. So let me explain what I mean. You see, what we need right now, as Prabhat has been pointing out, we really need a major demand stimulus. Okay, and how that money is spent, I think it's already been elaborated very well. But we have to have the state spending much, much more. No other segment of the economy is in a position to spend now. How people don't have money, workers don't have money, households cannot spend, investors are not going to come in and invest more in this kind of situation. It's only the government that can spend. They have to spend much more than they did last year just to revive the economy at all. Okay, the package that has been announced so far is deeply disturbing because first of all, they put in all kinds of things they were already planning to spend, and then they've added a little bit more. That little bit more is probably, my fear over the course of the year is that this is just the little bit that they're going to spend in addition, which is at most about 1.5 lakh crore. Nothing, right? What people have said, you know, maybe 1% of GDP, slightly less than 1% of GDP. Over the course of the year, their tax revenues are going to keep falling because GDP is falling, right? We're looking at least 15-20% decline this quarter, maybe more. So GDP will fall, their tax revenues will fall, they will feel fiscally constrained, they will start cutting down on other spending. So the net fiscal stimulus over the course of this financial year is probably going to be negative. That is absolutely disastrous. Okay? And that means that we are going to get an even worse slump than we would have had otherwise. So clearly, what needs to be done is of course, these are the broader, bigger issues that have already been raised, but immediately we must demand that the government triples its health spending, triples. I think Patrick has already pointed out how we don't, fills all the vacancies in public employment, makes Anganwadi and ASHA workers absolutely proper government employees, gives them proper facilities, does all of the basics that it should have been doing over all this time, but does it immediately. And increases the spending on education because we are really, Aruna mentioned it, depriving people of their basic access to education and so on. Dramatic increase in the rural NREGA and an expansion into urban. All of these things have been mentioned. But the point is we need very significant increases in aggregate spending. It should not be that there's a little bit of a package today, which is actually then eaten into by a reduction in spending over the course of the year. And that is what I genuinely fear, having seen what this government has been doing so far.
Vijayanand, your 2 or 3 points.
First point has already been made. Strengthening local governments, where I see a coalition of the elected local government with the self-help groups, understanding that India is casteist and a lot of corruption in local governments as of now, and with civil society organizations supporting. This is emerging in almost all parts of India when we had a discussion on what panchayats are doing now. That is eminently doable. And the roots of modern local governments go back to the public health crisis of industrial revolution. So they are very good at it. But now that has shrunk only to sanitation. No, bring it back to public health. And incidentally, the BJP in its manifesto has right to help you bring. So you throw it back at them and bring some even a weak right is better than no right. And to get doctors, India produces so many doctors, and even China produces doctors for India. So we need, just to say, to get a registration of the medical council, you need to work for 2 years in rural hospitals on payment, not free. So that is my first point. Second point is restored plan. Certainly government will not restore plan, but at least as a proxy plan for the social sector, which they may be willing. Scheduled castes, scheduled tribes. And migrants should now be, we have never used migrants as a target group, even in care, for your welfare and other measures. Now they become a group like anybody else, as a vulnerable group which needs a group of measures. And the next point is civil society is now organizing at the local level in loose alliances to combat COVID. So this should be used as an opening to get them back into this. Now, will this have, then also, which is mentioned, sorry for adding a point, the labor rights have to come back to the agenda, particularly the migrant rights. Will it get political traction? One, states. Most of the states are not with the national government. And today, UP has announced a migrant commission, for whatever it's worth. It's an unbelievable step. So we use that opportunity to focus on these rights and rewrite the code and those kind of things. All these are socially doable, but is it doable fiscally? And I'm not an expert on fiscal thing, but what the Americans call the quantitative easing is something where you will, it's just printing notes in different form, but that alone is the way, otherwise incomes will fall. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vijayanand. For the last quarter of an hour that we have, I request Navsharan to quickly sort of talk about the kinds of questions that our viewers have raised. And so in your closing remarks, then each of you could make your closing remarks, but also address some of the questions briefly. Navsharan?
Thanks, Harsh, and thanks all for an extremely thoughtful discussion. We've received a number of questions on what was said this evening. So basically, I bunched them, and there are 3 or 4 major areas. One is actually seeking response from the panelists on the options that states have. The questions are because all of you have said the center lacks empathy. So what can the states do to earn revenue other than increasing their borrowing? What choices do states have to address some of the crises that's erupted and in the states? There's also a question on how do we explain the fact that even when lockdown has opened, industries have started working, although very slowly, workers have decided they're choosing to go back
to homes, and what explains this? There's also a question about which Vijayanand just mentioned about UP government's commission, which of migrant commission. But the question also is that UP government is at the same time also trying to control mobility of workers by saying that states will now have to seek the permission of the UP government before hiring workers from the state. So where is this coming from, and what are the rights implications, and what's the constitutional validity of this kind of statement which the UP chief minister has made? And what consequences for the right to mobility of the workers, of which Aruna also spoke about. So I think if can we just go with the first round of questions, and whoever wants to respond, and then come back to a second set of questions. So could I please request Arun, maybe Prabhat, to talk about the options that states have in terms of generating revenue or responding to the crisis which has fallen on their shoulders?
You know, at this moment, the states have very few options, because when they signed away their rights to levy indirect taxes by signing on to the GST, basically there were just three commodities left in which they could, to some extent, muck about with the rates. One of them they're already doing, which is alcohol. You know, the Delhi government, the Haryana government, they're all raising the taxes on alcohol. But obviously there are limits to this. Therefore, revenue raising on the part of the states, having bartered away the rights to do so through the GST, is something which is very difficult. Borrowing, yes, the borrowing limits have been raised recently, but you see, borrowing has a problem. Borrowing means you borrow at an interest rate. Now, that interest rate must be higher than the rate of growth of the state domestic product. If you are not going to fall into a debt trap, then a necessary condition is that the the GSDP growth rate must be higher than the interest rate at which you borrow. Now, you know, at this moment, most state domestic products are going to experience either zero or even negative growth in the foreseeable future. To the extent that happens, borrowing at a positive interest rate from the market is actually going to make things worse for the state governments. So their options are extremely limited. As a matter of fact, they should demand that they be allowed to borrow from the Reserve Bank of India at zero interest rate, that their debt, in other words, should just be monetized. I think if all the states got together and demanded this, then that would have a big impact. Not that they're going to succeed, of course not. The center would not allow it. But on the other hand, it would actually focus discussion on the kind of plight of the states. And I believe they should demand zero interest borrowing from the Reserve Bank of India, like the government of India does.
Thanks. Thanks. Yeah. Aruna, would you like to say something about the UP government's recent mentioning that other states will have to take permission to hire workers, and what's the validity of such a?
There is absolutely no validity, but it is a political strategy now that's going to be followed. And I think I'm really afraid that because of the fear psychosis about COVID, that most of us as a nation have fallen in line with the restrictions on mobility. And I think restricting mobility is the first attempt of a government to control its people. Because freedom, I express my freedom through my freedom of expression, speech, and my freedom to travel. If I'm restricted in my freedom to travel, and I'm already restricted in my freedom to express, then how are we ever going to argue for those larger issues of dissent or disagreement or different points of view, of a critique of what the government is doing or what anything we disagree with? And the workers, they will be forced to move, and their mobility will be forced. Where they're needed somewhere else, they will be restricted from going where they want to go. Look at what happened to the migrants. Could there have been a greater tragedy? You first give them 4 hours, and in those 4 hours, you expect them to move. And when they want to go home, look at the kinds of conditions that they were subjected to. Now, I really do think that this underscores the fascist nature of the state. It underscores the fascist nature inherent in all these controlling mechanisms, including industry, including all the various people who use the labor. So I don't see any advantage in what UP has done. And I do think it's a kind of trailer for what might happen everywhere. And through restriction, the first persons who will be controlled are the labor, but all other people who have the right to freedom of expression, who have already been controlled in many different ways, will be further controlled. I do think mobility and the right to freedom and expression and the right to mobilize all go hand in hand. And I think this is one more manifestation of the kinds of restrictions, democratic restrictions that have been forced down our throats. So we'll have to resist it, we'll have to fight it, I think.
Thanks. A second set of questions is actually around what Prabhat said in one of his comments, that maybe we have to rebuild local rural economies and create alternative ways of imagining development in this country, or the path of development. So there are a number of people who are asking this question: how will that happen? What will happen to labor demand in the cities if labor is to be absorbed in agriculture, in local industries? How do we see rebuilding rural economies? Are they going to be at the cost of industrialization? What is the vision which is which you are saying in this context?
You know, I'm not against industrialization. I want to make it very clear. I'm simply talking about the fact that industrialization has to be led by the demand that comes from the agricultural sector, because that is the way to build a self-reliant economy. It has to be an export-led industrialization where export occurs from industry to agriculture, not from industry to all kinds of necessarily abroad, because then you are in a race to lower your wages so that you remain competitive internationally and so on. So I'm really visualizing a development strategy where things get turned upside down. That basically agriculture grows on the basis of that. There is a demand, that you have industrialization arising from that, and in the process you actually have a withering away of the distinction between the village and the city. Not that people are transferred from something called a village to something called a megapolis, which we call the city, but rather the distinction between the two simply disappears.
Right, thanks. Thanks. There's a question for Patrick and also Gopal. Patrick, you talked about, we are seeing sliding back of democracy, pulverizing of civil and political rights of workers and of poor people. So in these circumstances, what will be an authoritarian government's response when it has lost trust, and it knows that it has lost it, but it needs to continue to be in power? So what's the future looking for civil rights movements, for trade unions, for civil society activism? What would you like to say based on what you are seeing across the world?
Yeah, no, that's an incredibly important question. There's a running joke in the United States that the largest opposition party isn't the Democratic Party, it's the state of California. And I think one could make a similar joke in the Indian context, that The biggest opposition to the central government are not the opposition political parties, but the states, and Kerala would be an obvious example. There's no doubt that in a crisis like this, the instinct of any autocratic regime is to double down on authoritarianism, and that's what we've seen in Brazil, that's what we've seen in the United States, and it's what we're seeing in India. In India, it's a little more concerning simply because the BJP is so hegemonic. It controls the prime ministership, the executive powers, but it also controls the Lok Sabha. Whereas in Brazil and the United States, there's at least some capacity for counter mobilization in political society. But I have a lot of faith in Indian civil society. I'm members of this panel. The depth of commitment to the Constitution, as we saw in the CAA protests, the sheer capacity for innovation and the kind of local alliances that Mr. Vijayanand referred to. So I do have some faith in the capacity of civil society to respond, but there's no doubt that what's at stake is not only just the extraordinary injustices and increasing inequalities that we've talked about, but the very soul and essence of Indian democracy, which is a deep democracy in that it's incredibly decentralized in the nature of the actual practices, but of course is being threatened at its very heart, given the attacks on the independence of civil society.
Thanks. Gopal, would you like to come in on this question as well?
Yeah, it's fine now.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please.
Okay, the question is, can you do without the state at this point in time? The answer is no, because you require a state to really deal with the crisis. But what kind of state do you really want to have? Now, it's a very good opportunity for any state to actually reorient itself in favor of the people's demands. The first point that the state has to do is to become really pro-people, pro-humanitarian. That would mean that you must put your compassion before your reason, actually. You should immediately intervene and take people who are walking on the road into the buses and take them to their destination. And that is very pragmatic, but that is what is required at this point in time. So you require a government which is actually compassionate before it is reasonable to its own policy and its own economic packages. Now, so there is an opportunity for the state to become pro-people. And if it is not becoming pro-people, it is the duty of the civil society to actually mend its ways. And therefore, I think civil society in our country, I don't know whether it is, and this is also a question to Patrick now. Patrick, we have not a very robust civil society intervention in our country. It is already proved a number of times, except for the philanthropic efforts, which is actually marvelous to help people in distress. And then we appreciate all that help that they have actually given to people in distress and in frustration. Now, so the question is, can the state really give more spaces to people, for example, labor, to express their freedom? And you can express your freedom, realize your freedom when you actually have opportunities. Whether opportunities are there at the local level or in the metropolis. But you should give them enough spaces, opportunities to realize their freedom. Otherwise, freedom will remain as a very vacuous, empty concept. So I think there is a responsibility on the civil society and trade unions, of course unions, to actually bring necessary normative pressure on the state so that the state doesn't abandon the people and give them assurance, promises to reorient economy, opportunities, so that there is no, this is, I think, actually reorienting the state on a very egalitarian line. Now, this is a very theoretical, hypothetical situation. Will they really do? Will they have willpower? We have no answer to this. So I think we'll have to actually be very vigilant. Civil society has to be energized and has to be socially vigilant to look after the social rights of the people. That's actually, I'm just sounding very, very theoretical, but at the moment we can really expect the state to actually acquire a new incarnation to itself.
The civil society to remain vigilant. I think we're running out of time, but there's one last question which many people have asked in many different ways. Given our capacities, given the capacities of civil society of mobilizing people around real agendas, and given the empathy of the state, the union government, should we be redirecting our efforts towards addressing state governments and mobilization efforts in the states? So any final thoughts will be welcome.
Can I respond to that, Vijayanand?
Yeah, Vijay, that's a good idea.
I think the civil society should not even go to state government, they should go to the local government. There they are needed. And local action may not be advocacy and rights-based initially, but it is rights-based silently. Their livelihood, their social rights. And there's a lot of space in India because local governments in 90% of India have no capacity in terms of HR. So this is one way of getting your agenda widespread. And whatever be the deficiencies of panchayats, which Ambedkar has rightly pointed out, this is the only place where social democracy and political democracy can start, thanks to our self-help groups, which are 6 million, and elected representatives who are 3 million. There's a huge possibility. And this is a point to Professor Heller. We have been dialoguing that I find Kerala moving from a welfare state to a caring state. So it is possible even with huge fiscal stress. Thank you.
Thanks.
I actually think we have forgotten how to get to people. We get to the people, we get a fund of common sense, we get a fund of possibilities, we also get a method and a structural arrangement through which we can do something. And I think that is why this present government, in its astuteness and its cleverness, and I don't think it is an intelligent government, has put spokes in so many wheels that we can't get to each other and can't talk. So I think primarily that is possible and we should try and get over it. The question is, it's a challenge, and we, apart from Zoom and other such virtual media, we'll have to get to places where we can get together, talk, and do something, and I think it is possible.
So Aditi, on behalf of the Constitution Conduct Group, excuse me.
Yeah.
Hello, Harsh, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's been absolutely scintillating. I have to really say it's just been breathtaking to hear everybody, because everyone has really focused so clearly on what the situation we're facing. I would just say on behalf of our group that perhaps this is a wonderful time, as Prabhat said, for just a re-envisioning of society. I mean, he mentioned that, try and think actually of how employment can come to agriculture rather than people from agriculture seeking employment in mega cities and so on. But I think these things have to be fleshed out. I mean, what is peasant agriculture in today's context? And we have added conditions, what is the craft economy and so on. And the second point that I think, again, everyone has really adequately mentioned is just the fact that democratic rights of civil society, of people, of around the gamut, have been completely suppressed, and there's been a huge concentration of just any kind of rights, any kind of forward movement or any kind of intellectual thought on anyone's part. So I think these are the two things that I think I would also like to just say, that maybe there is need for a, you know, as Ashish Kothari, Asim Srivastava, they talk about, you know, deep ecology. So what would that be? How is that going to be translated? And I think we should start thinking about it. And otherwise, you know, this conversation you've begun, I think I'm looking forward to it continuing. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Aditi, and thank you, my very dear friends. I think it was truly a very, very, very important conversation. I do believe that we are in a moment not just of unprecedented crisis after independence, but also it's a civilizational crisis. It's not just a humanitarian crisis. It is a crisis of the kind of people we are and have become and have allowed ourselves to become. And I think we're witnessing a moment for of moral crisis in this civilizational movement, and therefore the new imagination that we talked about is extremely valuable. Uh, uh, while uh, while our brothers and sisters in, in city slums and city streets, and much more in the countryside and in the forests and the coastal regions, are going to face uh, what I fear are near famine-like conditions. They're going to face the outcome, the consequences of the spread of the contagion, where there'll be no facilities for them to respond. It requires the very best in all of us in this moment of civilizational crisis to stand in true solidarity with them at this moment, but also to ensure, to promise ourselves that we will not allow a situation of this kind to recur in our country. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.